Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. See how Uber is helping Canadians get to their medical appointments with Hope Air at uber.com/hopeair.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you for your support of Political Capital Daily, the audio podcast. We're ending our spring-summer run and coming back on the Daily Show in September. But Political Capital Prime, which you're watching and listening to now, we're coming to you weekly for the rest of July. Appreciate your support and subscriptions to all the different feeds and platforms. Let's bring in the pod squad for this week. Jillian Oliver, former BC Green strategist. Jeff Ferrier, former NDP strategist. Appreciate you both being here. Angelo Isidoro did do Political Capital Daily this morning, but then was befallen by the baby bug. You know when you have a baby in the house and suddenly everyone gets really sick really fast? It just happens. It just happens. So he is off. We'll see him next week, but we got lots to talk about here. First, I want to get into the backlash over the housing bailout. 1 week after Prime Minister Mark Carney and Premier David Eby announced a multi-billion-dollar housing plan, there are critics who say that the government's decision to use some of that money to buy unsellable condos in British Columbia and turn them into rent-to-own units is a misuse of public funds and a bailout for developers. So Eby and Carney were both up this week. They both tried to defend it. They both pointed the finger at each other. They both struggled to explain it. What did we make of how this has played out and turned in the span of just a week, Jillian? It seemed to have gone from good money to, this is a bit of a political problem for both the Premier and the Prime Minister in just a week.
Yeah, super messy. The Premier gave some indication that the federal government really wanted to rush the announcement out. It kind of seems like this was sort of a bit of a half-baked plan. The Prime Minister was going to be in town for the FIFA game, and they just wanted to make an announcement. I think, that tells us lots of things. It tells us, still this Carney government is not doing its homework on issues in BC. Which is really astonishing because his housing minister is, of course, Gregor Robertson, whose Vision Vancouver party no longer has any seats, largely because of their perceived coziness to developers. It just kind of, as someone from BC that works in politics here, it kind of boggles the mind that they just would have no political read on the sort of public attitude towards developers, and that they wouldn't have some more details available at the press conference, because now they're playing catch up and trying to explain. And we got some more details, and it sounds better. Rent to own. Eby was resolute that this is not going to be a bailout, that he expects developers to lose money. It's not going to be in Vancouver, where the most expensive units are, because the numbers don't work. It's going to be in places like Vancouver Island and the Fraser Valley. But I think on the political side, most people are probably not reading those details. They just got the week's worth of bad headlines that this is a developer bailout, and I think it's going to be really hard for them to turn back the tide on it.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, Jeff. We constantly see BC and Ottawa not quite on the same page, and the federal government not quite showing up in British Columbia the way it should. And here's one where the Prime Minister is getting questioned about it and has to sort of admit that, we didn't do a great job rolling this out. And then the Premier has to do the same thing. He says, we kind of got forced to do it early to accommodate the Prime Minister. And then the two of them are trying to explain that. And it's, Ophelia's trying to explain it as well. But she just wants to talk about proportional representation. And that's not a topic on the show anymore. What did you make of the kind of back and forth of the Prime Minister and the Premier this week on this, Jeff?
Yeah, that's a suboptimal look when you're trying to put forward a signature good policy. I think, we talked about this last week, and I flagged that the developer bailout was going to be the big challenge on this. But again, the idea is sound. You buy empty condos at below the construction cost. Let first-time buyers use part of their rent to build a down payment towards ownership. buying the housing cheaper than building new and getting it faster than building new. But it opens up all kinds of questions that neither order of government has been able to answer. Details matter on this. So, what's the purchase price? Who absorbs the loss? Which projects qualify? What will the rents be? What might the mortgage payment be? How much of each rent payment will build towards equity? What's the eventual purchase price? Will the program be income tested or open to everyone? Lots of big questions. And if government has a policy winner here, they need to answer those questions and fast.
They've been negotiating it for months. So that's the interesting part of this, is that we heard from the housing minister months ago say BC wanted a made in BC version of this plan. They didn't want the Ontario housing plan, which was a broad-based tax cut, an elimination of their HST on new home purchases up to $1 million, which has boosted the Ontario housing market. There are people out there buying because they're saving up to $130,000 in taxes on a new home purchase. And the Premier said this week, we didn't want that. We wanted to do this instead. And he blamed the developers for wanting the tax cut. But I just wondered, the two different constituencies of voters we're talking about here. In Ontario, anyone who's buying a new home, maybe they owned a previous home or whatever, they're getting a tax break and they're out buying. In BC, it's first-time home buyers, probably income tested, because this government income tests everything. It's two completely different constituencies of voters, two different programs, Jillian. Would BC have been better off trying the tax break like Ontario, or is it targeting the right group, or what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, new homeowners in BC already get a GST tax break, so that's why the Premier said he didn't want to do it. I think it makes sense in BC to be surgical because you do see so many different sets of circumstances depending on whether or not you've been in the market already. I think maybe it doesn't make sense to give someone who has made $1 million or more in profit on a home a break on flipping if they flip to another one. I don't know. I mean, I think like Jeff said, the devil's in the details. It's really going to depend on what kind of a deal they're able to get and who they're able to get these homes to. I think it's going to be a challenge. And it makes me wonder if the government, in addition to wanting to get these homes in the hands of people who can actually live in them, is also worried about some of the other things like developers not being able to build more. Obviously, we want to see them build more things that people want to live in rather than these small one-bedroom apartments. But if they've got all of these empty condos sitting on their books, they're just not able to. And we've seen a real slowdown in housing starts. So it makes me wonder if there was a little bit more pressure in BC because the government is looking at the situation and kind of panicking.
Jeff, one is popular, the Ontario model. People like it. One is unpopular, the BC model. People don't like it. Is that relevant to this, or as Jillian pointed out, surgically it makes a lot of sense? There's a group of people who can't afford a down payment, but the way they've gone about it may not be politically tenable. Maybe it would have been better if BC just took the cash the way the Ottawa offered, and everyone had a 7% cut on buying a new home for the next little while.
But not everyone would have had that tax cut. If you're worried about governments rigging the system for developers, that HST or GST exemption should worry you a whole lot more. Imagine you're trying to sell a home you've poured your savings into. Along comes a developer selling a brand new condo. Because GST only applies to new homes, not resale homes, government wipes away the tax for the developer's buyers, but not for the ordinary family who's trying to sell their house. Mm-hmm. Suddenly you're competing against a tax break you can never offer. And that's how government can really rig the system in favor of big developers and leave everyday homeowners trying to protect whatever equity they have left. And that's what's happening in Ontario. And I think what the Premier has said is that's not something he wants to see happen here in BC.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good way to put it. Okay, great. Good round there on that. When we come back, we want to talk about the Premier's trip to China, some of the things he intends to accomplish there, and even returning early for some other announcements. So we'll get back to that right after the break. Welcome back. Premier David Eby readying his trip to China from June 27th to what was supposed to be July 3rd. He's coming back a day early. We'll talk a little bit about that. Going to Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou to, in his words, strengthen partnerships, create new business opportunities for BC businesses with the second largest export market in China. It's the first premier to go in almost 20 years. I want to start with one thing he plans to do here, which is visit Chinese EV maker BYD, which is coming into the Canadian market because the Prime Minister has lowered the tariffs on that. Not all the premiers are happy about that. Ontario's premier thinks it's going to hurt Canada's auto market. The U.S. president isn't happy about it. Should the premier be going to this? Is he kicking a hornet's nest? Is it a good use of his time? Where's the Team Canada elbows up in this, Jeff? Going to BYD in China, good move or not, do you think?
I think it makes sense from the perspective that if he wants to have China build the cars it's selling to Canada and build them in Canada, then it strikes me that's a valuable conversation to have with them. And that is elbows up. That's trying to get jobs from China into Canada, which we would all appreciate. And imagine if we had a car making industry in British Columbia, that, maybe the federal government would pay more attention to British Columbia and our needs out here than they have been. And I think what the trade mission is about is just as you've described. It's about finding new markets for BC products, whether it's lumber, LNG, critical minerals, technology, agriculture, at a time when our economy is under real strain and people are worried about their jobs and their future.
But like, Jillian, if Doug Ford went to an overseas trip and, started wanting to buy lumber cheaper from that country because it's just cheaper and better, BC would be ticked off. I just wonder if there's any political risk for the premier going to, promote Chinese EVs when it's not really in the country's interest, unless, as Jeff points out, they build factories here and build the cars here as well. But it kind of feels like a little bit of a poke to a major sector in Canada.
Certainly could raise some ire from Doug Ford, but he's got a lot of his own problems right now. Melanie Joly was in China just before EV's visit and was pushing this. She's told them that if they want to increase the number of EVs, because there's a cap, it's going to be a pretty small percentage of the Canadian market that will be Chinese EVs that are allowed in. They need to build here and form joint ventures with Canadian manufacturers and start building stuff here. There's been other countries that have successfully done this. I understand Stellantis is looking at it to see if they can get in there. And it's also, I think the federal government is probably looking at it as a bit of a bargaining chip as they are in the CUSMA negotiations to say, look, we have other options, whether or not it comes to fruition. And if it does, existing car manufacturers in Ontario are not happy about it. So that tells us something about the potential reality of it. But, I think we'll just have to wait and see. At the end of the day, I think China is our second largest trading partner. Things aren't going great with the US. We got to look for other options.
Yeah, I can't imagine if the premier was doing this trade mission a year ago or at the peak of the kind of Trump CUSMA backlash that we would be going to China to promote EVs at the cost of the Canadian auto sector. But I guess, a year and a half later, BC's just doing what it wants. I want to add a wrinkle to this here. One of the things that the premier's coming back early for, a day early, is an MOU with Ottawa. He says he's going to be there with the Prime Minister to announce some type of agreement. July 2nd for an MOU seems like it would be related to July 1st with Alberta's oil pipeline deadline. It feels like this might be like what BC's getting for the pipeline, Jeff. We know the Massey Tunnel project, the North Coast Transmission Line are two things the premier mentioned. Is this basically BC's kind of compensation for a pipeline? Does that look like what this might be shaping up as?
That's a very cynical view, Rob.
I've never been accused of being cynical before, but I'll take it.
I think it's British Columbia realizing that it needs to strike a deal with Ottawa that's commensurate with what Alberta has gotten. Because if that's not in the case and Alberta gets that pipeline, BC looks like it's in a very weak position. As you've noted, we've already heard about North Coast Transmission Line, which is critical for LNG and mining. We've heard about the Massey Tunnel replacement, which folks in Delta and Richmond will be pretty happy if Ottawa contributes towards those costs and then we get that project actually moving. But I'm hearing the government agreement goes well beyond that. That if what I'm hearing is true, it goes well beyond what the premier has already talked about. It's a much bigger pipeline of infrastructure projects, and that would mean good jobs and stronger economic growth in the days and weeks ahead, which is the premier's priority in difficult economic times. So stay tuned. This could be a really significant announcement.
It feels like it better be, Jillian, because the Massey is a black hole. Like, people just want it done. It's not going to be a big ticker tape parade for federal money for a project that's going to be 3 times over budget, probably. And the North Coast transmission line is not going to be done until like 2032, 2034. Like, it feels like BC's got to get something more to compensate for what is going to be, Alberta's pipeline celebration. But maybe that's just me. What do you think of this MOU? Whatever it is.
I mean, I think the provinces are in a situation right now where most of us have big deficits, especially BC has a big deficit, and Ottawa is in the mood to be handing out money. And so if they say jump, you gotta jump, I think. And so those projects are, things that BC really wants. There's lots more that we really want. And I think that's what it's about. It's about making sure that we're showing Ottawa that we're here, we're paying attention, we're ready to build and taking what needs to be done seriously.
I still think it's just me, but I still think it would have been better if we had asked for, some sort of annual compensation from Ottawa or part of this pipeline, and then earmarked that money, hive it off and say this $300 million a year or whatever it is going to expand some sort of social program. And here's a direct benefit that British Columbians see for accepting the risk of this thing. And maybe that's in the MOU, but if it's just, here's a bunch of money for a Massey tunnel that's way over budget and is 9 years late and has ticked everybody off, I'm not sure it's going to fly, as they say. But let's pause it there. We got one last topic here. E-scooters. This is a good one. Come back after the break. We'll talk about that. Welcome back. E-scooters. A menace on the streets or simply a terror on the roads? Let's discuss this immense threat to public safety. Are they death traps on wheels? What is going on with e-scooters? We've had a 15-year-old boy seriously injured in Burnaby this week. We have a 13-year-old boy in Maple Ridge who was injured recently on an e-scooter hitting a car. All sorts of e-powered vehicles, e-bikes, e-dirt bikes on the road, weaving in and out of traffic at many kilometers an hour. BC Children's Hospital says 81 e-bike or e-scooter ER visits in the last year, more than double the previous year. There's calls from municipalities for the province to regulate these things. Jillian, I would never get on an e-scooter. Well, I feel like the helmet would affect my hair, but also mainly in general, I don't think they're safe. Do you think the province should be stepping in here? Is this a risky situation to try and regulate, or what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that it seems like with these anecdotes that have been making headlines, it's an enforcement issue because nobody under the age of 16 is supposed to be riding them. So what can the government do? They could designate them only in bike lanes. There's other cities in Europe that have done that. That makes it much easier to enforce because they're not everywhere. Much easier to enforce. I like the use of bike lanes because there can be ample signage, which I find as an e-bike rider encourages better behavior. We could also require insurance, which I think would make parents less likely to allow their children to illegally ride the scooters because it would void the insurance. I think those are things we should be looking at because as they get more popular, there's going to be more of these incidents. And a brain injury for a kid is devastating and will affect them for life.
These things can go like 40, 50 kilometers an hour. I'm driving my vehicle in a municipality where the speed limit is 40 kilometers an hour. I have to have insurance. I have to have multi-level license testing. And then I look to my right and some kid on an e-scooter is whizzing past like the speed of sound with nothing. It's like no one even checks, Jeff. It strikes me as somebody's got to get a hold of it. But at the same time, it's not going to be a popular thing for any level of government to try and do.
I think it might be. I think BC needs consistent e-scooter rules right across the province. For folks like me, I drive, I cycle, and in both cases, they're annoying and they're dangerous. Jillian, I got to disagree on those bike lanes. I've almost been clipped, half a dozen times by e-scooters who speed by me while I'm laboring to get a bicycle going using my legs. So, but I think, Jillian, you're right on, set a minimum age, cap speeds, make helmets mandatory, keep e-scooters off sidewalks, use geofencing to automatically slow or disable them in crowded pedestrian areas like Granville Street during the World Cup. And I think this is actually something that would be welcomed by the e-scooter businesses who would want sensible regulation, clear, consistent rules. That would give people confidence that e-scooters can actually be used safely, and that's ultimately good for business.
I'm not even going to start on my rant about electric golf carts, which suddenly have appeared on the streets of Victoria. Tourists rent them and pile in and just piddle around Victoria on the streets. And electric golf carts? What the heck is that? You've got golf carts, and then in the bike lane, you've got e-scooters, and it's just like, it's chaos. I guess I did do a bit of a rant on that. But anyways, I think it's a fascinating topic because so many people like the idea of using it, and it's so cheap and affordable that the minute you start to make it difficult for them, they're going to get upset, and governments are going to be like, whoa, maybe it's not a vote getter to touch this thing, but we shall see. Thanks, Jeff and Jillian, for being here. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe. We'll be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. See how Uber is helping Canadians get to their medical appointments with Hope Air at uber.com/hopeair.